In 1773, Captain Cook became the first modern explorer known to have breached the Antarctic Circle and reached the ice barrier. This expedition offered an exciting chance to find proof of either the flat or globe Earth models, because Captain Cook intended to sail completely around Antarctica looking for inlets through the ice wall. If the Earth was indeed a globe 25,000 miles in equatorial circumference, as the heliocentrists claimed, then a complete circumnavigation of Antarctica would be approximately 12,000 miles. And if the Earth was flat, with Antarctica surrounding the entire circumference, a complete circumnavigation of Antarctica would have to take over 50,000 miles. During 3 voyages lasting 3 years and 8 days, Captain Cook and his crew sailed a total of 60,000 miles along the Antarctic coastline, never once finding an inlet or path through or beyond the massive glacial wall. Captain Cook wrote, "The ice extended east and west far beyond the reach of our sight, while the southern half of the ocean was illuminated by rays of light which were reflected from the ice to a considerable height." Later voyages by Captain James Clark Ross and Captain George Nares in the 19th century further confirmed Cook's findings. Ross's expedition spent 4 years and 5 months in heavily armored warships, failing to find an entry point beyond the southern glacial wall. And Nares spent over 3 years circumnavigating Antarctica, taking an admittedly indirect course, but clocking in nearly 69,000 miles total. If Antarctica truly was the tiny ice continent claimed by globe Earth proponents, all of these expeditions would have ended years sooner. In addition to this, many Antarctic explorers, including Captain James Clark Ross and Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, using globe Earth projection maps, wrote in their journals perplexed at how they routinely found themselves out of accordance with their charts, stating that they found themselves an average of 12 to 16 miles outside their reckoning every day, later on further south increasing to as much as 29 miles per day. These huge discrepancies experienced by explorers the further south traveled are usually attributed to increasingly strong storms, winds, and currents, but if that were the case, they should have just as often found themselves ahead of their reckoning, which they never did. In 1783, the hot air balloon was invented, and for the first time in recorded history, people were able to float miles above the Earth's surface and see for themselves once and for all whether or not the Earth was flat or a globe. To many people's astonishment, as high as they rose, the horizon remained perfectly flat 360 degrees around them and rose to the level of their eyes all the way up. J. Glaisher wrote in his Travels in the Air that, quote, "On looking over the top of the car, the horizon appeared to be on level with the eye, and taking a grand view of the whole visible area beneath, I was struck with its great regularity. All was dwarfed to one plane. It seemed too flat." M. Victor Emmanuel, another hot air balloonist, wrote that, quote, "Instead of the Earth declining from the view on either side, and the higher part being under the car as is popularly supposed, it was the exact opposite, the lowest part like a huge basin being immediately under the car, and the horizon on all sides rising to the level of the eye. As stated previously, this is only possible on a flat plane." It would be an entire century after Newton published his theories on gravitation before any scientific experiment was devised to attempt to prove its existence. In 1797, Henry Cavendish, the British scientist, Freemason, and wealthy grandson of the Duke of Devonshire, created an experiment which he claimed successfully proved the existence of gravity, measured its constant, and provided accurate figures for the exact masses of the Earth, Sun, Moon, and planets. How did Cavendish achieve this quantum leap for heliocentric pseudoscience? He fixed 2 large lead balls on opposite ends of a torsion balance and hung them from the roof of his shed. By watching and recording slight motions of the contraption via telescope through his shed window so his mass would not affect the reading, Cavendish claimed to have proven gravity. 2 small lead balls were hung near the large ones, and any motion observed towards one another was touted as being the influence of gravity. Now, the Cavendish experiment has been widely criticized by the scientific community because never in over 2 centuries since its creation has anyone been able to replicate it. Firstly, the balls simply do not always attract one another as they must for the so-called gravitational constant to be constant at all. Sometimes the torsion balance turns towards the balls and sometimes away, as it is impossible not to give some slight tremulous motion when interacting with it. Henry even complained in his notes how often as he was performing the measurement, the contraption was still in oscillation. Secondly, since his calculated force of gravity was 10 to the 39th power weaker than the force of electromagnetism, from which all material objects are composed, there is no control for the experiment which can factor out and positively differentiate the alleged gravitational force from the known stronger electromagnetic force. In other words, the balls could simply be attracting each other through static electricity, a known force existing in all things, billions of times stronger than gravity, and impossible to control for the experiment. Even though no one could replicate Cavendish's findings, the experiment went down in history as a great success and is still taught as veritable proof of universal gravitation in science textbooks today. Half a century later, in 1851, a French scientist named Leon Foucault performed a similar experiment to Cavendish, but this time hanging a single ball from the ceiling, swinging it, and claiming all lateral motion observed to be proof that the Earth was turning beneath the pendulum. Since Foucault's original demonstration, these pendulums have regularly been swinging at museums and exhibition halls worldwide, purporting to provide everlasting perpetual proof of the heliocentric spinning ball Earth theory. The truth is, however, unbeknownst to most of the duped public, that Foucault's pendulum is a failed experiment which proves nothing but how easy it is for pseudoscience to deceive the malleable masses. To begin with, Foucault's pendulums do not uniformly swing in any one direction. Sometimes they rotate clockwise, and sometimes counterclockwise. Sometimes they fail to rotate, and sometimes they rotate far too much. Just like the Cavendish experiment, scientists who have attempted to replicate Foucault's findings have conceded time and again that, quote, it was difficult to avoid giving the pendulum some slight lateral bias at starting. In truth, the behavior of the pendulum actually depends on 1. The initial force beginning its swing, and 2. The ball and socket joint used, which most readily facilitates circular motion over any other. The supposed rotation of the Earth is completely inconsequential and irrelevant to the pendulum's swing. If the alleged constant rotation of the Earth affected pendulums in any way, then there should be no need to manually start pendulums in motion. If the Earth's diurnal rotation caused the 360-degree uniform diurnal rotation of pendulums, then there should not exist a stationary pendulum anywhere on Earth. Also in the mid-19th century, another Frenchman named Gaspard Gustave Coriolis performed several experiments showing the effect of kinetic energy on rotating systems, which have ever since become mythologized as proof of the heliocentric theory. His Coriolis effect is often said to cause sinks and toilet bowls in the northern hemisphere to drain spinning in one direction, while in the southern hemisphere causing them to spin the opposite way, thus providing proof of the spinning ball Earth. Once again, however, just like Foucault's swinging pendulums and Cavendish's hanging balls, sinks and toilets in northern and southern hemispheres do not consistently spin in any one direction. Sinks and toilets in the very same household are often found to spin opposite directions, depending entirely upon the shape of the basin and the angle of the water's entry, not the supposed rotation of the Earth. The Coriolis effect is also said to affect bullet trajectories and weather patterns as well, supposedly causing most storms in the northern hemisphere to rotate counterclockwise, and most storms in the southern hemisphere to rotate clockwise, to cause bullets from long-range guns to tend towards the right of the target in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. Again, however, the same problems remain. Not every bullet and not every storm consistently displays the behavior, and therefore cannot reasonably be used as proof of anything. In the late 19th century, mostly thanks to the experiments, books, and lectures of an English inventor and author named Dr. Samuel Rowbotham, a flat Earth renaissance began sweeping the world. Rowbotham's findings, beginning with his 1864 book, Earth Not a Globe, an experimental inquiry into the true figure of the Earth, proving it a plane without axial or orbital motion and the only material world in the universe, caused quite a stir in the scientific community, and thanks to 3 decades of his effort, the shape of the Earth became a hot topic of debate around the turn of the 19th century. Dr. Rowbotham conducted several experiments using telescopes, spirit levels, and theodolites, special precision instruments used for measuring angles in horizontal or vertical planes. By positioning them at equal heights aimed at each other successively, he proved over and over the Earth to be perfectly flat for miles, without a single inch of curvature. In his most famous series of experiments, Rowbotham traveled to Cambridge, England, where there is a 20-mile canal called the Old Bedford, which passes in a straight line through the fenlands, known as the Bedford Level. The water has no interruption from locks or water gates of any kind, and remains stationary, making it perfectly suitable for determining whether any amount of convexity or curvature actually exists. If we were living on a ball Earth, every pond, lake, marsh, canal, and other large body of standing water, each part would have to comprise a slight arc or semicircle curving downwards from the central summit. If the ball Earth were truly 25,000 miles in circumference, as claimed by heliocentrists, then spherical trigonometry dictates the surface of all standing water must curve downwards an easily measurable 8 inches per mile, multiplied by the square of the distance. This means along a 6-mile channel of standing water, the Earth would have to curve 16 feet 8 inches downwards from one end to the other, and or dip 6 feet on either end from the central peak, depending where the measurement is taken. Rowbotham tested first by standing in the water holding a telescope 8 inches above the surface, while his partner rowed away from him in a small boat with a 5-foot-tall flag attached. If the Earth was indeed a globe 25,000 miles in circumference, by the time the boat reached Welney Bridge 6 miles away, the entire boat and flag should have been completely invisible, hidden behind a 6-foot-tall mass of curved water. In reality, however, every time tested, the entire boat and flag remained visible from start to finish. In a second experiment, Dr. Rowbotham placed 7 flags along the edge of the water, each 1 mile distant from the next, with their tops positioned 5 feet above the surface, and stood with his telescope behind the first. If the Earth was a globe 25,000 miles in circumference, each successive flag would have to decline a definite and determined amount below the last. The first and second flags established the line of sight. Then the third should fall 8 inches below the second, the fourth flag 32 inches below, the fifth 6 feet, the sixth 10 feet 8 inches, and the seventh flag should be a clear 16 feet 8 inches below the line of sight. Even if the Earth was a globe of 100,000 miles, an amount of easily measurable curvature should and would still be evident in this experiment. But the reality is, not a single inch of curvature was detected, and the flags all lined up perfectly as consistent with a flat plane. In 1870, one of Rowbotham's supporters, an English scientist of the Royal Academy named John Hampden, offered a public wager of £500 to anyone who thought they could prove the Earth spherical by repeating the Bedford Level experiment. Alfred Russel Wallace, a fellow English scientist, ardent evolutionist, and personal friend of Charles Darwin, accepted Hampden's wager, and the two met with referees to decide the matter at the Bedford Level. The original plan was to repeat Rowbotham's flag experiment, but after hours of attempting to align them one on each mile marker, upon looking through the telescope, quote, they could not even judge which was which, let alone decide whether the line of sight along them was flat or curved. Heated debate ensued, an angry quarrel followed, and the experiment descended into a farce. They called it a day, but a week later reconvened, this time Wallace setting new parameters for the experiment, which had never been tested or approved by Rowbotham or Hampden. Wallace hung a large calico sheet from the Old Bedford Bridge, with a thick black line painted across its center, and positioned his telescope 6 miles south at Welney Bridge at the same elevation. Then, halfway between these 2 points, Wallace placed a long red pole topped with a marker disc designed to fall in line with the black painted marker and telescope. All of these he placed at a masonically significant 13 feet 3 inches above the water. Wallace's plan was to view the marker disc and black line through the telescope, and if the middle marker appeared below the line of sight, this would be taken as proof of the water's flat surface, and if the middle marker appeared above the line of sight, it would be taken as proof of Earth's curvature. Hampden immediately took issue with this new method of allegedly determining curvature, but begrudgingly accepted to continue. When viewed through the telescope, the center marker fell a tiny bit below the telescope crosshair, and the far marker on the bridge fell a tiny bit below that. This result was not expected by either party, but Wallace quickly claimed it proof that the Earth was curving downwards, while Hampden claimed the results to be in accordance with the law of perspective over flat surfaces. This time an even more heated debate ensued, until Wallace refused to speak another word with Hampden, gave him the silent treatment, and even had the police escort Hampden from his hotel room before leaving town the following day. The referees for the wager decided in favor of Wallace, and the money was given to him. In response, Hampden immediately published a 16-page pamphlet denouncing Wallis as a liar and cheat called "Is Water Level or Convex After All? The Bedford Canal Swindle Detected and Exposed." Another fellow English author and flat-earther, William Carpenter, also present during the experiment, wrote his equally scathing 30-page review of the swindle entitled "Water Not Convex, the Earth Not a Globe, Demonstrated by Alfred Russel Wallace on the 5th of March, 1870. Hampden later took Wallace to trial and sued him for his £500. The court formally decided in favor of Hampden that the bet was invalid and returned his money in full. Next, Hampden immediately reissued his challenge to Wallace, increasing the wager to £1,000 and inviting Dr. Rowbotham to attend. This time the experiment would be conducted as Rowbotham had originally done, standing in the water with telescope held 8 inches above the water, observing a boat with a 5-foot flag attached sailing 6 miles away from Welch's Dam to Welney Bridge. When the day of the wager came, poor weather prevented them from completing the experiment, so they postponed, met more bad weather, and postponed again. On their third and final attempt, before heading home with the weather still overcast, they attempted the experiment. Unfortunately, shortly after reaching the halfway point, the boat became indistinguishable beyond the haze, and the bet was called off.